All right, so we are now talking about vascular plants. So far in this unit, we have been looking at non-vascular plants, the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, and we've talked a little bit about the adaptations for plants moving onto land. Well, one of the biggest things that helped them to move onto land was that they developed vascular tissue. So let's talk about vascular plants and what extra evolutionary steps had to happen for them to exist. So first and foremost, there's two kind of main groups within the vascular plant group. And the first one is the seedless vascular plants, and we consider those to be ferns, as well as a couple other examples, which are a little bit less talked about. And then there's also the seed-bearing vascular plants. Sorry, I think I forgot to say these are called seedless vascular plants. And the seed-bearing vascular plants are ones that, as the name would suggest, actually produce seeds. And I know my picture is covering this, but the two examples here are Gymnosperms, which are cone-producing plants, and Angiosperm, which are the flower-producing plants. So out of our major characteristics to think about whenever we're looking at vascular plants, the first one is should be pretty obvious. They have vascular tissue. And if you remember back to when we talked about this, one of the previous sections of notes, vascular tissue comes in two different forms. First form is xylem, and xylem is the type of vascular tissue that transports water. And generally, if you think about the direction where water would be coming from and where it's going to be going to, it's going to be absorbed in the roots, and then it's going to travel through the roots, up the stem, and then toward the leaves. It needs to travel there because that's where photosynthesis is going to take place. Now, alternatively, phloem is the type of vascular tissue that's going to transport the food that's produced by the plant. And whenever the actual food is being made, it's being made in the cells generally that are at the surface of the leaves, wherever there's going to be chloroplasts and chlorophyll, which is the pigment that's going to help them to produce food. So any of the cells that can perform photosynthesis can potentially create food, and once that food is made, it has to be transported throughout the rest of the tree or whatever the plant is, so that it can provide food for the cells, just as our body needs food for our cells. So phloem transports food. Remember the F sound of food, and phloem should help you to remember those two. You see in the picture over here, it mentions that there's the movement of sucrose. Sucrose is just one of many different sugar types that a plant can produce by the process of photosynthesis. When we studied it a couple weeks back, we talked about glucose, which is another type of sugar. It's a really common one. And it's also a common one that we eat as humans after we are getting the food from our plant sources that we get food from. Then once the food is made, like I said, it's transported throughout the entire plant. The last major characteristic about a vascular plant is that they have true roots, stems, and leaves. All the previous things we've looked at so far, the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, even though they had some simplified version of each of those things, they were relatively early forms of them. You can kind of think about it like the first version of an iPhone or the first version of any technological thing. It generally didn't have all the kinks worked out, and it wasn't super efficient. It wasn't very good at transporting each of those structures. Roots, stems, and leaves weren't great at doing the tasks that they were meant to be doing. And so as those plants evolved over the years, they became more efficient at performing each of the tasks of those particular structures. Roots, in other words, are better versions of what were called rhizoids in the mosses. In other words, roots are better able to hold a plant in the ground. They are able to grow larger, they're able to grow deeper, and they're also able to absorb more water. The stems of vascular plants are able to hold a plant higher up in the sky. Remember, non-vascular plants are generally 2 or 3, maybe 4 inches tall. They generally tend to stay really small and close to the ground. And then finally, the leaves of plants that are vascular plants are much more substantial, whereas the green portions of non-vascular plants, once again, very close to the ground. And while they might be very bright in color, a lot of non-vascular plants are pretty bright, vibrant, neat things when you find them in the woods. But they are very close to the ground, and they cannot spread out very well. So with all of this, if we look kind of very quickly at the way that science classifies these groups, and we talked about all of these kind of plants had some major changes that started to occur. The origin of plants happened roughly around 470 million years ago. And as those initial forms of plants that we know of as plants came about, they came about from green algae that was most likely most related to the types of green algae that are protist-based organisms. And so as that started to happen, you had some additional branches that occurred throughout the years. And one of the first ones that happened is you had non-vascular plants, our mosses, and then you had the first vascular plants starting to branch off in this direction. And this is kind of similar to a family tree, what you might have with your cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents and great-grandparents. This is showing relationships between all these different groups. And what you start to have here is with the seedless vascular plants, these are the first group of vascular plants that actually have xylem and phloem, but they haven't actually evolved seeds yet. Seeds will come later on down the road. Not too much later, but they do evolve later on. The groups that we know of as seedless vascular plants are ferns, and we're going to talk about them in just a minute. And then a little bit after that, we had the development of plants that produced seeds. And after a certain period of time, you ended up having that group branch into two separate groups. And the main things that we refer to this group as now are Gymnosperm and Angiosperm plants. And we'll talk about this more in a second. So what is a fern? A fern is a type of plant that produces spores to reproduce primarily. Remember, a spore is similar to what was used as reproduction in fungi. And so a spore tends to be an asexual way of reproducing. When it lands on the ground, it will begin to grow in that way. And as that starts to grow, there's some additional complication that I'm not going to expect you guys to know for this type of reproduction. But generally what happens is that spore will start to grow, and with an extra stage in there, it will actually grow into an adult fern. Once they've actually, one of the neat things about ferns is they've actually, because they have xylem and phloem, they can actually live a little bit further away from water than their earlier counterparts, the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. In other words, their ancestors that needed to be really close to water. They also have specialized roots, like I talked about. So they actually have true roots, not the rhizoids that the mosses had. They also are really well adapted for starting to move further away from water, which is a really big step. But the big thing that's different from them and the seed-bearing vascular plants is that they actually don't produce seeds. And we're going to see why that's a pretty significant thing here in just a little bit. This is just a quick showing of how these actually produce spores. So on the underside of a fern, if you ever get a chance to visit some of Missouri's state parks, there's a lot of really great examples of this really wide variety of fern species that Missouri has. And if you look on the underside, generally these are found on the underside of a fern frond, you'll end up finding these kind of furry-looking things on the bottom. They always kind of remind me of some creature that's living under there, but this is actually part of the fern. It produces spores, and like many of these other examples that we're going to talk about, the spores will drop into the wind, and the wind will carry them away. And wherever they land, that's where they will start to grow. Occasionally, they'll get carried by water too, but generally, wind. They tend to be dispersed by wind. The spores, that is. So once these, this is a picture of a cross section of one of these red dots. It's called the sorus. They drop spores into the air. That travels and lands on the ground and begins to grow into an adult fern, and the whole process starts over. But once again, this is not a seed. That's the really important thing to remember. Next, we have our seed-bearing vascular plants. So there's a couple characteristics, there are a few characteristics shared by both of these major groups. Xylem and phloem, obviously. There's also the beginnings of these things called root hairs, which are just little extensions from the roots. They help with water absorption. Something called mycorrhizae, which we'll talk about more in a second, and water-saving adaptations. Remember, water-saving adaptations are anything that help a plant to live further away from water. So mycorrhizae, super beneficial, and if you think about a symbiotic relationship, remember, is where both organisms benefit. So in this case, it's a symbiotic relationship between plant roots and fungi. And you can see what happens when you have grass or some grass-like plant that's growing when it has mycorrhizae versus when it does not. And you can hopefully tell that this grass is growing a little bit better, and it seems to be looking a little bit healthier, and there's a lot more things in the soil than maybe blank space. Hyphae are the specialized fungal tubes that help a fungus to actually absorb food, and those are going to be used. The hyphae are going to be used to attach into the roots of the plant. The reason why this is so helpful is because fungi actually will help to absorb more water for the plant, and then the plant is in return going to give the fungi food. And the question is, why can't the fungus just make its own food? Well, hopefully you know that a fungus is a heterotroph, and therefore they need to obtain food from something else. Other water-saving adaptations, obviously you have the waxy cuticle. The stomata help to prevent too much water from being lost by the plant from transpiration. And there's other adaptations as well that we'll talk about later. Gymnosperms are the first example of the vascular seed-producing plants. They produce naked seeds, and they reproduce using cones. Generally, they're pollinated by wind. There's lots of people who have allergies to the pollen of gymnosperms because it's very prolific at certain times of the year. You will see cars covered with kind of a fine dust. A lot of times that's from pine trees. And this group includes conifers, pine trees, cycads, and ginkgos. Lots of really cool examples, and this is just a quick diagram showing these different stages. Lots of different examples here. We'll talk about these more in class. These are your cycads, ginkgos, and then some of the pine trees. Now with angiosperms, these are our flowering plants. These reproduce using flowers. They are pollinated more than just using wind. They can be pollinated by wind, water, animals, and a whole bunch of other things. And they also disperse their seeds using each of those techniques as well. We'll spend a whole bit of class time on going through these parts of the flower, but for right now, just remember anything with a flower on it is going to be considered an angiosperm plant. And this is just a great showing of how different animals can be used to help pollinate. These are some examples of how angiosperms actually disperse their seeds in the different evolutionary traits that they have to do that. Some are carried by wind, by animals, some by water. So some really cool techniques. This is one obviously using wind. Everyone should be pretty familiar with, of a dandelion. Lastly, this is just showing the difference between a naked seed, which is from a conifer, and an angiosperm seed, where the seeds here are covered in a fruit. So that's just a quick run through of the vascular plant groups, and we will talk more about these in class. Remember that you should be filling in your note sheet with this information. Thanks.